In August of last year, the Census Bureau released their decennial population data and states kicked off redistricting. So far, 40 states have completed drawing up their congressional districts, and the rest are scrambling to finish in time for the midterm elections. Going into this redistricting process, things didn't look rosy for Democrats or progressives. Republicans now control a majority of state legislatures, which oversee redistricting in most states. According to 538, Republicans control the legislatures of 20 states for a total of 188 House districts, whereas by comparison, Democrats have control of states that contain only 73 districts at most. And of course, Republicans are famous for gerrymandering districts in ways that carve up certain areas, most notably those containing non-white people and other perceived Democratic voters, and lumping them in with others so that the new districts conveniently end up with a reduction in Democratic voters. As this graphic shows, Dems can have more votes and still end up with less seats. As the New York Times lamented after the 2020 census data was published, Republican mapmakers will seek to dilute the emerging Democratic strength in the nation's suburbs by packing some of those voters into urban districts while joining others to conservative rural districts. Last month, CNN echoed this fear, but additionally noted that Democrats will also gerrymander to their advantage whenever they can.
Our elected representatives have a lot more incentives to work together if there were more competitive and really representative congressional districts. But that's not happening by design. Let's dig into the data. So there are 31 states where maps have been finished and not dismissed by the courts, but just 22 congressional districts that are considered competitive, according to the Brennan Center. Now, 10 years ago, there were double that number, 44 at this point in the cycle. In 1992, there were 108 competitive districts. See a pattern? Now take a closer look at Texas, where State House Republicans drew lines to go from 12 competitive districts to just one. Yeah, they really don't want to deal with close elections. And Democrats have been getting into the action as well. Take New York, where they likely reduced the number of Republican seats from 8 to 4. Now, Republicans rightly point out that this is unfair. Democrats would control as many as 85% of the congressional seats, but don't comprise 85% of registered voters. Now, Republicans are challenging this in court, but their argument would be a lot more convincing if the GOP hadn't consistently opposed redistricting reform at the federal level.
But while redistricting gets a lot of attention because it's so often overtly a partisan grab for power, gerrymandering is actually only a very small part of what's stopping Democrats and progressives from gaining more power at the national and even state level. The problem isn't limited to a handful of bad actors or even a reactionary political party like the GOP that's deliberately trying to undermine democracy. The larger problem is that the combination of A, the geographical concentration of Democratic voters in cities, and B, the very nature of winner-take-all elections, structurally prevents Democrats from winning seats proportional to their share of the vote. Here's why. So take a look at this map. Most people who follow politics already know that while Democrats dominate elections in cities, Republicans consistently trounce them in rural areas. The reason this is such a problem, as political scientist Jonathan Rodden points out in his book Why Cities Lose, is that our current electoral system, which is made up of small districts that elect only one representative using a winner-take-all system, consistently disadvantages voters in cities. As Rodden writes, in many U.S. states, Democrats are now concentrated in cities in such a way that even when districts are drawn without regard for partisanship, their seat share will fall well short of their vote share. Because of where Democrats live, the very existence of winner-take-all geographic districts has facilitated the systemic underrepresentation of Democrats. In other words, because they're so heavily concentrated geographically, it's extremely difficult for Democrats to translate raw votes into seats, both in Congress and in state legislatures. And while Republican gerrymandering certainly exacerbates the problem, the consistent underrepresentation of Democrats will never fully vanish as long as we keep our current electoral system of people voting in small districts that elect only one winner-take-all representative. So what does this all mean for a left that's trying to find some way of achieving reforms like Medicare for all on a national level? To put it bluntly, it means we can't just stick to racking up wins in cities. First, it is important to note that the American left, small as it is at the moment, is arguably in better shape now than it was a decade ago. Particularly over the last 5 years, the ranks of the Democratic Socialists of America have grown to nearly 95,000 members, with at least one chapter in every state. Dozens of self-identified Democratic Socialists have been elected to city councils and state legislatures across America, and we now even have a few socialists in Congress. As Jacobin contributor Jared Abbott recently put it, this is no minor achievement given many previous decades in the political wilderness. However, geography is still a serious hurdle. Most of the left's wins to date have been concentrated in urban centers, much like the base of the Democratic Party itself. Progressive Congress members like AOC and socialist state legislators overwhelmingly represent solidly Democratic districts in major cities, which means that we on the left face the exact same structural constraints as our moderate Democrat counterparts in national and state elections. To quote Jared again, "It is becoming increasingly clear that the tried and true method of picking off centrist Democrats in deep blue districts is reaching its strategic limit." In other words, it's essential for the left to start building a larger and more geographically diverse working class constituency, which means contesting elections in rural areas and small towns in order to gain some leverage nationally. There's also obviously a moral and ethical component. Simply put, rural America has been devastated by neoliberalism. This shouldn't be too much of a surprise. Capitalists have found it more profitable to locate the hubs of their businesses in cities. As Professor Mark Edelman wrote in Jacobin in 2020, since the turn to more cutthroat free market policies in the 1980s, American capitalism has systematically underdeveloped rural and small town regions of the United States. The 2008 crash poured gasoline on the fire. Mutual savings banks and credit unions, cooperatives, mom and pop businesses, local industries and newspapers, health and elder care facilities, schools, and libraries have all fallen victim to relentless austerity policies or private equity raiders. So this is to say that over the past several decades, rural areas have suffered from chronic underinvestment, crumbling physical infrastructure, and the swift erosion of social institutions. Since 2005, more than 180 rural hospitals have closed, and at least 21 have shut down since the start of the pandemic. We also know well at this point that opioid use and incarceration have skyrocketed in rural America, as have so-called deaths of despair or suicide, drug overdose, and alcohol-related liver disease. Now, winning rural voters is, of course, much easier said than done, and to call the situation before us an uphill battle is probably an understatement. In 2016, for instance, a majority of rural voters held a negative view of all of the candidates running in the Democratic presidential primary, including Bernie Sanders, though it probably has to be said that rural voters did rate Sanders least negatively out of all the Democratic candidates. But the point is that even if we're starting from square one, under our current political system, there are few alternatives to winning more rural voters. Moreover, if the left cannot break out of the cities, and particularly the more affluent precincts within those cities, our entire political project will flounder within America's rigid electoral system, and the few progressives that are elected will find it increasingly difficult to avoid working with corporate Democrats. In other words, we can't settle for our current clustering within urban centers, no matter how well we're doing there and no matter how many centrist Democrats we manage to defeat. The viability of our entire project depends on successfully organizing working people outside of cities. If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.